As Megan said, I'm from California, and I started getting involved in writing a textbook when they wanted more than one point of view, and my point of view was coastal, uh, East Coast, West Coast, as opposed to Midwest. But things have changed, and I think we've all seen the impact of that. Usually a textbook is done every 3 years, but obviously last year was not the same as regular time. And as the year progressed from March, and we had the COVID-19 issue happen where everything basically shut down for a while, I saw how it impacted childcare. And I saw how it impacted my students and our childcare on our college campus. And my daughter is a director at a childcare center that was serving the first response people, doctors and nurses and first responders in the fire department and in emergency care and the grocery store workers, the people that were actually out there. And they were having to deal with this. And I watched how everybody scrambled. And I thought, this is going to make some major changes. And so I asked if I could actually do my next edition early, because I really felt the information that was happening in the world needed to be included. Then we get to May, and I'm already doing research for the book. And then we had the George Floyd incident, which led to me looking at some things that I hadn't looked at before, honestly, and they needed to be looked at. And so the idea of equity and social justice, and it is important in childcare, came up. And so I did more work on that. And I have some friends who helped me that had different experiences that I had. And then adverse childhood experiences. This was something that had been percolating in my head since early in the year that needed to be done. But after I saw all of those things happening at once, I just knew that it needed to be taken care of. So what I did was to completely retool my book to have all of this information. COVID-19 and the impact on childcare has been huge. It has changed things, and it may change things for going forward. We don't really know. We know we're down to at least 3 things, according to the CDC, that is really important. They did if you want to look this up, they did a great slide program. And just last week on the 21st, for middle schoolers, I think probably could be used up to preschoolers, because it's very simple, simplistic, and it kind of explains what children need to do. And it is down to 3 things, as I think we all are: the mask wearing, the washing of hands, and the social distancing. But it's had other impacts. So we're going to talk about that. And supporting equity and social justice. I don't think we think about this, but institutionally, we are a country where things institutionally are basically based white-centered European American perspective. We think about white Christian, middle-class, heterosexual, and abled. That's how we measure everything, and that's not how things are. There are some big changes that have been happening, and we just can't ignore them. And then adverse childhood experiences, preparing for trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive care. And I have to tell you, since I've done this, I've done more research, and I'll get into that, because we're really now working for calling it healing engaged care, trying to heal and not just be trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive, but to go beyond that. And how all of these relate to how we need to change how we teach and respond to children, because it makes a very, very big difference. We know that the pandemic happened. We were all there. This is one of those things where we're all in the cohort. It doesn't matter whether you're, 3 years old or 93. We've all lived it, all over the world. So this is kind of the definition of a pandemic. It's affected us all, and it's caused past pandemics from these viruses. And also in that middle school video of CDC, it actually explains a lot of this. So it was really interesting to see, because last year in trying to find this information, it was basically, I was getting it as it was happening, and it was kind of a moving target. It still is a little bit, but we know some certain things. We know that it occurred in China. We all know that. It's not any other name but that. It is a virus that is COVID-19. COVID stands for coronavirus. It happened in 2019. So that's why it is called COVID-19. We didn't even know how it originally occurred, and they've done now. They know it's respiratory tract. Some of the things that they told us at the beginning are still true. Some of them have changed slightly, but we know basically they really originally thought it was respiratory droplets, and airborne transmission was something that was secondary. What we know now is it is including the respiratory droplets. Airborne transmission is definitely one of the ways, and occasionally contaminated surfaces. That is not as predominant as it was when we were first finding it out. But if any of you are involved with childcare centers or have your students, you know that the cleaning has been ramped up radically because of possibility of those contaminated surfaces. There are 3 major ways to prevent the spread. These are still 3 major ways to prevent the spread: hand washing, mask wearing, and social distancing. Whether those change when everybody has been vaccinated or not remains to be seen, and whether we reach the herd immunity, or when we reach the herd immunity, those can take a things. But we want to make sure that children have that kind of safety. So we know that childcare had to accommodate these things: social distancing, mask wearing, and hand washing. But it changed other things. When a child arrived at care a year and a half ago, they arrived with their parent walking them into the room, holding their hand, greeting the teacher, talking to the teacher, etc. That's not how it's done today. Children are usually dropped off by the parent, having someone from the child care center walking them into the classroom. They get their temperature taken. The parents get asked whether the child has any of these symptoms. Have they been exposed? There's questions that they have to answer every day. That wasn't the norm, and this will probably still continue for a while. So we know that has changed. We know that I think one of the important things, the people that I know who work with children love children. They love being around them. They love hugging them. They love supporting them. But 6 feet social distancing is not conducive to that. It changes that. So a lot of how teachers have dealt with some of the things with their children has been changed. Now, I know that there are some teachers who probably are still hugging the kids. They decided it was worth it. And we didn't even know whether it was safe, but we have to be able to protect the children as much as possible. We also know that childcare and early education was upended for many children. Not all child care facilities were open. In many states, they were closed. Some states, I believe Rhode Island was one of the few that there was always some open. Some closed only for a week or maybe two. Some opened 3 months later, some opened 6 months later. It just depended on the state, and it depended on the school district, what they were doing, or the private owner of the child care, if it was one of those, not a state-sponsored child care. Children were upended. Some child care and early education was delivered online. That was a lot easier for children who were in 1st through 3rd grade, but it was a struggle for really young kids. It was very difficult. What they really need and always need is a stable and daily routine. And teachers were having to scramble to do that. And I really admire all the teachers from infant, toddler through 3rd grade teachers, because that's early childhood is the first 8 years, trying to do that. We ourselves need to stay calm in this situation, and providing nurturing relationships, which was very different, as I said a minute ago. And children are going to ask questions, and you had to listen to them and make sure you gave them an honest answer, as honest as you could possibly get with the information that we had. We know that it also made families who might have had food insecurity definitely have it, and even more. We actually ended up with a much greater degree of food insecurity. It tripled actually from 2019 to August of last year. It's interesting to see how the different ways that the community, I can just say the greater community, came through to offer some food. But we know that generally about 1 out of 6 children is food insecure. They are saying, and they being the powers that be doing the research, that as many as 1 in 4 families may have been food insecure in this last year. And why did that happen? Well, there was a major disruption of the food chain because of lockdown. Slaughterhouses, meat packing plants, those sorts of things, they closed for a while. They were opened up by decree. People got sick. Milk got dumped because there was no middleman. There was a lot of things that happened to have that food chain disrupted. Now, I realize toilet paper isn't on a food chain, but that's just one example how people hoarded things. Too, that was another thing. People hoarded food. They hoarded rice. They hoarded flour. They hoarded a lot of different things. So it disrupted the food chain, and there was a shortage of some foods. I don't know where you are in this country, but I know in California, in Southern California, where I live, that the prices have gone higher, maybe up to about 15% higher over this last year. There are social inequities, as we know, that people of color were more likely to get COVID than people who were not of color. Those people who were of color, some of them tended to live in more low-income areas. They had less access. They didn't have as high income. So all of that had the effect on what do you do for food insecurity during a pandemic. And we all experienced what it does to us. I actually didn't go in a grocery store for nearly a year. I Instacarted it, and it was not a very satisfying experience. So there was large-scale unemployment among a lot of low-wage workers. That helped add to that. And what did the government do? They actually responded fairly well. SNAP had a thing called the Pandemic EDP, and that SNAP is the food program for the government. And the Pandemic EDP allowed more people to be under that program. It allowed a little bit more money. WIC, which was Women's, Infants, and Children, it expanded. And the National School Lunch and Breakfast programs tried to offer food to kids, whether you actually had to drive through for it, or whether you had to walk up to get it, or however way. But not all people were served that way. So the public response also was important for those families who did not get enough food through the government response. There was a public response. And that public response was led by Feeding America. They had places like stadiums in certain areas where you would go through once a week or a couple times a month, and they provided food to different families. There were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that were served in this way. Churches also helped to help with this gap, as did local groups like the Rotary Club and the Lions Club. Places like that did help, but the food insecurity was still there, and we're still having issues with it. So exactly what is equity and social justice? This is the next thing that popped up last year in the news. We know it's racism. Racism is here to stay. Racism is institutional, it is interpersonal, and it is internalized. And those of us who are looking at this issue are doing like I am, the self-reflection that is needed. We're having to think about things we might not have looked at. One of the things that we know is that racism exists in early child care. It can't help, because almost all institutions in the United States have practices and policies that are based on racism. They're not doing it consciously, particularly, but we have that perspective that this is right, and anything that is outside that norm is considered. Children are considered at risk. They may be considered deficient, and they may be considered that they need intervention and they need correction. And that's how we have operated. One of the examples of this would be where children are expelled. We know as a fact that children are more likely to be expelled from preschool, from the ages 3, 4, and 5, than they are from kindergarten to 12th grade. On average, 3 times more likely. In some states, like in Massachusetts, 39% of the schools and everything were 13 times more likely to expel these children. Who were these children? The majority of those children were of color, and the majority of those children were African American or Black boys. And what does that do to them for the rest of their lives? It basically puts them at a disadvantage for the rest of their lives. And whether they stay in school or don't stay in school, whether they end up incarcerated or not incarcerated, it all stems from that. We know that incarceration rates for people of color are far higher. They're disproportionate. 60% of the prison population are people of color. And that is way higher than the percentage of population that is of color. So we know that has had an effect. Unequal access is caused by poverty. It may be caused by where you live. If you live in a low-income neighborhood, you don't have as great of an access, which also affects the school readiness gap. If you don't have access to quality childcare before quality preschool, your access to education from then on may be compromised. The other thing that has to do with equity and social justice is something that has been occurring more and more lately, and that is the understanding of gender development and gender diversity. We have had a lack of this type of understanding. And what we've come to find out is, we know as far as gender identity, that children usually by the age of 4, but usually around 3, start to identify what their gender is. Well, we now know that it's going beyond that, because children are identifying as early as 5 as being not the gender that they were born with. So that's something that we're having to deal with. We know that recent events have shown that we don't necessarily practice equity and social justice as much as in our society as we should. And how do we change this? Early care and education is a way to do it. So NAEYC has a position statement on this about advancing equity in early childhood. And Kaiser and Minsky suggested 3 principles from that position statement that teachers should adopt. Being cognizant that self-awareness, humility, respect, and a willingness to learn are keys to becoming a teacher who equitably and effectively supports all children and families. That takes a lot of self-reflection, it takes a lot of awareness, and it takes a lot of understanding. And that is important. It's important for race, it's important for access, and it's important for gender development, knowing that children may be identifying with a different gender than they were born with. And so we have that knowledge that you may go into a classroom and be presented with something that you didn't expect. We need to prepare our students to understand what is happening and the changes that are happening in society. The NAEYC also says learning about understanding diversity and culture and how they impact early education environment. We've had anti-bias education for a long time, and it went pretty well, but it probably didn't go far enough. And what we need to do is take that a little bit further. And then we need to know that the families are remind ourselves that the families are the main socialization for the children and their development and how they learn. And if you're not working and engaging with families and accepting the diversity that those families have, you need to do something about it. We're not 1950 in this country anymore. It is 2021 and things have changed. And in order to work with children, we may have to make some changes ourselves. So we know that 50% of children under the age of 6 are of color. That happened in 2018. They're expecting by 2050, the majority of people in this country will be of color. It may happen sooner than that. We have to realize that accommodations and understanding need to happen. And 40% of teachers are women of color. And when we talk about, trying to, we know that racism exists. Why haven't these teachers talked about it? Why haven't they maybe if you have some in your centers, why haven't they said anything? Well, it's threatening to them because if they speak up, they feel that they might lose their jobs. So we need to understand that too. People need to be able to advocate for themselves and for others when we talk about racism. Unequal access, we know that Latino and Black children are far more likely to have disadvantage. They don't have as many resources, they don't have as many schools available to them, and they have a lack of access to healthcare. That has been really been pinpointed with COVID, that people of color and people in low-income areas do not have as much access to healthcare as they should have. And as I said earlier, our cultural norms are middle class, Christian, white, heterosexual, and able. That's how we have operated, and that is institutionalized and in our policies. So that needs to be looked at. Gender and gender development, it's a social construct. So what is changing? A child may have the body of one sex, but their identity and their social gender may be different. So we have to realize what might be happening for some of the young children we work with and try to figure out what we need to do to help them. And that's part of what I think our job is as people who are teaching the students who are going to be working in the classrooms as teachers. So another thing that has come up, and this actually, historically, this has probably been on the radar maybe the last 6 or 7 years. It's actually been around for a while, but it hasn't really hit child development and early childhood education until fairly recently. In the 90s, the 1990s and the late 1990s, actually in San Diego, where I'm from, Kaiser did a study. They wanted to know why people in their 40s and 50s and even 60s, why they were having certain issues: cancer, depression, diabetes, heart conditions. And they wanted to trace back, and they did some looking at history. And this was with a fairly large study. And what they came up with was that a number of these people, a large number of these people who were having issues that along those lines, heart disease, the depression, diabetes, cancer, actually had what is called an adverse childhood experience. And their thing was, if we can know about this ahead of time, we can help to heal those people before they get that age and get sick. So knowing early on, maybe to ask some questions, but it didn't filter down to education for a number of years. And so what is this? Adverse childhood experience is basically a childhood trauma. In 2005, Harvard came up with the idea of toxic stress, which is the buzzword, or one of the words that I think most of us are familiar with. And toxic stress and how it changes children and how it changes their brains can be an issue. And because of that, with this trauma, we need to understand exactly what it might be. So the definition basically of a traumatic event is an event in a child's life that is either frightening, dangerous, or violent, and poses a threat or perceived threat to a child's life or their bodily integrity. These feelings can also appear if they witness a physical threat to a loved one or something like domestic violence. Substance and Abuse Mental Health Services Administration defines trauma as a single event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that have a lasting and harmful effect on an individual's functioning and overall well-being. So we know today approximately 1 out of every 4 children in the United States has experienced at least one form of trauma. Now, what are those traumatic things? Here are a list of the general adverse experiences: physical, sexual, and emotional abuse or neglect. We've known that one. Domestic or community violence. Community violence would be something like witnessing a shooting or a beating or something in a community, like in a park. If you lived in Chicago, in many neighborhoods, as a child, your parents don't want you to go outside because of what might happen with the gun violence. Substance abuse and substance use, natural or human disasters or pandemics. Natural disasters would be a flood or something along that line. Human disaster could be a mass shooting. It could be something like a mistake in a chemical factory, and the gases go everywhere and you have to get out of your house, and things aren't safe. Or actually it could be water in Flint, Michigan. Or pandemics, which we haven't really experienced one for more than 100 years in this country, and we have experienced it now. The sudden loss of a loved one, and that could be through death or through divorce or incarceration. And I'll go down to the military family-related stressors, deployment. You're also losing a parent for 6 months or a year or whatever, and maybe fairly consistently since 2000, since we've been at war in Afghanistan and Iraq for off and on for that 20 years. Bullying. Children actually start bullying or being bullied as early as preschool. They don't wait till elementary school anymore. And it isn't just boys who bully, girls bully too. They're more likely maybe to bully relationally as older children, but children still do bully so they get bullied. Serious accidents or life-threatening illnesses, any child who's been through cancer or anything like that, or have a family member. Your mother has breast cancer, or somebody in your family had COVID. That has an effect. And especially if you lose somebody for something like that. And homelessness, housing instability, or food insecurity. All of those boxes are being checked even more than normal under COVID. And military family, as I mentioned, having refugee or having war experiences. We do have a number of people in this country where they have come from war-torn countries. We have people at the border right now who want to be considered to be refugees because they are trying to escape war experience because of the drug situation in some of the South American countries. And then we have racism, homophobia, and systemic suppression. That covers a lot of territory. And we know that 1 out of 4 kids we can define have at least one of those. But some children have more than one, and some can lead to others. Over 90% of the women who abuse substances were sexually abused as children. So that's 2 right there. And we know that that has happened to as many as between 1 and 4 and 1 in 3 people has been sexually abused as children. So those experiences take a toll. The risk factors, this is the, came from Kaiser. This is the risk factors that determine the severity of the trauma with ACEs, and it builds up as you go along. The severity of the event can tell you something like COVID for some children might not have been as severe, but for some children it was very severe because they might have lost a family member, maybe a grandpa or another family member or a neighbor that they loved. The reaction of caregivers, how did the people react? Did they support the child or did they ignore the child? If the parent was involved in, or caregiver was involved in the situation and they had no reaction at all, the children didn't have anybody to turn to. What were the family and community factors? What kind of support? Did they have access to something that helped them? What was their prior history of trauma? Often you will find that some children may have had as many as 4 or 5 different traumatic events, and their proximity to the event. With COVID, we've all been close. With racism, if you're a child of color, you've experienced it. You're right there. And the age that children are exposed can affect the size of the cortex in the brain. I'm going to stop sharing this for a minute and find another screen to share with you. That is this one. This came from Child Trends, and it's available on the internet. But this is the impact of childhood trauma, and I just wanted to show you this for a minute. We know that it impairs the readiness for children to learn. It helps, it delays problem solving and language. It affects their concentration and their academic achievement. They can end up with a smaller brain size. They can have less efficient processing, an impaired stress response, and actually a change in gene expression. And the physical health, this was what Kaiser was studying. And this is what it can lead to: sleep disorders, eating disorders, poor immune system functioning, cardiovascular disease, and a shorter lifespan. But behaviorally, we know they're going to show some of these things in acting out and their emotions. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. And then mental health, this is another thing. They can be depressed, anxious, negative self-image, have post-traumatic stress, and suicide ideation. And this is something I wanted to really have you look at. You've worked with children, or your students have worked with children who've had problems with attachment, who've had problems understanding social interacting, who've had difficulties forming relationship with peers, and who are victims of intergenerational cycles of abuse and neglect. The typical experiences, the reactions of 0 to 2 and 3 to 6, and I think you've all been emailed these. If you look at these very carefully, you will recognize that in many children. In many cases, it has nothing to do with it. But if there is a child in the classroom who has challenging behaviors, that child may very well be someone who has had adverse childhood experiences. So what do you do about it? Well, I'm not here to solve the world's problems, but one of the things that we know is that it affects how we teach children and how we interact with children. And we have been led to understand that we need to have what is called trauma-informed care. And we actually, and beyond this, I do know that this trauma-informed care has been something that's been around for, like I said, 6 or 7 or 8 years. But we're now looking at things a little bit differently. And there's another screen I want to share with you. This is, these are from Ellen Golinski, who is working with the Bezos Foundation. And if you're not familiar with her, she is a childhood advocate, has been for many years. I met her in the 90s. I've seen her in the early 2000s at NAEYC conferences. She's a key speaker. She's noted for her work with children and families. She used to work for the Work and Families Institute. And so she is telling us that we've got to go beyond trauma-informed care, understanding the trauma. And for these reasons in particular, that adversity is not necessarily the child's destiny. If they've had the adversity, we need to be able to help them and understand that. To stereotype a child, oh, this child has had some ACEs, and so we need to help them. Stereotype them is not helping the children, or stereotyping the families is not helping the families either. And then people who have experienced trauma shouldn't necessarily be defined by their trauma. Some people are more likely to be victims than not. It may have to do with whether they've had more experiences or not, but they shouldn't be defined by that trauma. And so by not stereotyping them, we are less likely to define them. And then what we need to do is build on the children's and the family's assets. That's what Golinski is talking about, is asset-informed care. Now, that doesn't sound like it deals with trauma, but building on the family's assets, finding out what the family is doing well and what the child is doing well, and building on those. And so we need to move from trauma-informed to asset-informed care and addressing the root causes of the trauma. Now, that's not necessarily something that the teacher is going to be doing, but that is something that the community may have to help with. If you have in an elementary school, a school nurse, or if you have some situation, maybe in your Head Start, there may be somebody counseling, but try to get services for the family so that you can move into that. And what we're trying to do now is kind of head toward healing-centered care. This is kind of a new buzzword. It was started by Dr. Ginwright, Ginwright, and his work is in the racial injustice field, but the whole idea of healing-centered care and what we have to do is important. So what I've tried to do is to let us all understand what is happening for children in their lives today. We know for many children, COVID may be an ACE. We know for some children, the racial injustice or gender discrimination, all of those things could lead to, for a child, toward an ACE. So we have things that are forefront, and I really feel that we need to do what we can as the people who teach the teachers to inform them, to try to give them strategies, to try to give them things that they can do to help the children that they will be working with. Because there's nothing worse than being unprepared in the classroom and not knowing. I did a study, and it was actually close to 30 years ago. We were seeing children with behaviors that you couldn't really recognize, and children were having some physical things going on, and they were having some other things they couldn't quite, you could teach them how to do something, and 2 days later they couldn't remember. They didn't know how to do it. Sporadic mastery is what it was called. And we finally figured out and traced that it had to do, these children may have been exposed to substances in utero from substance abusing mothers. And these were things that happen, and some of the behaviors that happen. And that was hitting about 11% of children that were born. So the fact that, about 11% of children one time in the early 90s had some sort of substance abuse that they were exposed to that could have affected them physically or emotionally. I now see, and I look back and see how that Kaiser study, it wasn't just that. It could have been so many other things. And I feel almost ancient that we're just waking up to this now, because this is something that we need to do today to help prevent this from happening 30 or 40 years down the road, because this is a generational thing. If a parent has had some childhood trauma, the fact of how they parent may actually open up a child to childhood trauma, and etc. So if we can help kids today deal with the trauma that they may have had already, it's not only an issue for the children, it could be an issue for the teacher. And so that's why I revised the text to include all of that, because these are issues and things that the students who you are teaching are seeing in the classroom. and it could be things they're experiencing and may not understand. So I hope that you take a look and see what it might do to help you be better informed, and to have your students be better informed so that they could do the best that they can in the classroom.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Kathy. We actually do have some questions here. We had a person ask how you position the U.S. system of capitalism in the conversation about inequities and social justices. What are your perspectives regarding the negative influence of capitalism and its relationship with the isms we face in the U.S.? Racism, genderism, ableism, etc.
I did not address that. And I have to be honest with you, I wasn't getting that technical. I think that we all understand, and that might be something I look at for the next edition. My thing was I had a certain amount of time, the turnaround time from when you start a textbook and to when you finish it. Fortunately, since this one is basically online, you don't have to go through the print time, but it's a very short timeline, and I just didn't have time to delve that deeply.
Very nice. So another question that we have is, while the pandemic is a relatively new issue for today's children, is there anything in your experience that has sort of mirrored the effects like you have seen occurring with children dealing with the outfall of the pandemic?
You know, over the years, and there's a lot of years, I have seen a few things, but nothing with the wide ranging. I've seen children in areas where they've had wildfires, and the effects of the families and the kids having an experience like that, and how it has changed them. You know, they can't go back to their home. They have to start all over, not having the same place to live in. I mean, it's a little bit different. I know that that's happened to families who have been through floods and hurricanes, and the same thing. It affects that area, but this is, you know, the whole world. And so I don't believe we've had anything in my lifetime that has had that much of an effect with children. I have a daughter-in-law who is, she's a therapist, a family therapist, and she thought she was prepared for just about anything. And this has thrown her, all of her cohorts in that field, it's thrown them for a loop. They thought they knew the answers, or at least things that could help people. And they've never addressed anything this wide ranging.
Another question we have from Sue over here. Best practices for teaching encompass healing-centered childcare education and dispositions of strength-based and growth mindset. Since these are foundational aspects that should be taught in teacher education programs, do you think that there have been aspects of healing-centered care and education that we have been advocating for all along?
Yes, I do. But I think we haven't specifically applied it to circumstances that are happening. Yes, definitely. There was all kinds of, in the mental health chapter, which I added, I want to say the third edition, because of the things that people in our center were seeing, that the teachers were seeing. And there's best practices for a lot of different things throughout the textbook for certain things. But as far as that is concerned, definitely, I do believe that we've long since done the healing centered care. But I think what Golinski and others are pushing us back to understanding that trauma is there. We need to be informed. We need to be sensitive, but we've been healers all along. We didn't just understand what it was we were healing. And that's, I think we can be better healers if we have greater understanding.